Stewart.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a special privilege to welcome to our program this evening a very great expert on several subjects, and particularly the life of the Grizzlies, and we will spend much of our program talking about the grizzly, and we're also going to deal with hiking and camping and river rafting and wildflowers and nature in general. Our guest is Dr. John Craighead, who is a professor at the University of Montana, and at this particular time he's involved with graduate students that are studying in the field of wildlife, and he's the director of the Wildlife Research Unit. He supervises those graduate students in that field. Dr. Craighead, it's a pleasure having you on our program.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Also joining and questioning the guest this evening will be two of our regular panel members, Mary Lou Reed, who holds a bachelor's degree from Mills College and did graduate work in religion at Columbia University, and Dr. Ken Wright, who holds a bachelor's degree from Portland State University and a PhD from the University of Idaho, teaches in the field of chemistry, and is chairman of the Division of Physical Sciences at North Idaho College. A welcome panel. We'll proceed to questions, and the first series this evening will come to our guests from Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Dr. Craighead, as you know, the grizzly is a very fascinating creature, and we're just dying to have you tell us the straight skinny on the grizzly. What kind of a creature is he? Is he friendly, or is he mean? What's he like?
He's big, and he's powerful, and he's aggressive under the right situations, and yet he's has a respect for man too, so that when he gets the scent of man, frequently retreats. On the other hand, if man invades his habitat, if the bear is cornered or injured, then the grizzly can be very dangerous.
Is the grizzly bear temperamental?
That's a hard question.
Or is that an anthropomorphic term?
The grizzly is rather difficult to predict, partly because we don't know enough about it, the behavior of the grizzly, but normally, as I mentioned, the grizzly won't attack unless it's startled. The distance that between the bear and the man, which will incite the grizzly to attack rather than to run away, varies with the individual, varies with the conditions. The distance is often much shorter of the female with cubs than it is with a female without cubs, and it's even greater with a male bear. But there is a critical distance in which the grizzly itself feels threatened. And when man has breached that distance, the bear will frequently charge.
How do you estimate that distance if
well,
for a bear without cubs?
Well, it's very difficult because it does vary with the individual animal. But anything less than 100, 150 yards is not very safe.
That's quite a great distance. You might not even be aware that the grizzly was there in 150.
No, not in wooded country, but in open country you certainly would see it. And a good precaution to take when you are in grizzly bear country and camping out is to pick a tree, pick a camp near a tree that you can climb, because the grizzly doesn't climb, and one safe retreat is to get up a tree.
How do you feel about a grizzly bell? I wore one for a little while until everybody made fun of me in grizzly country, and so
I don't think it would help very much. Actually, if you talk or sing, the human voice is much more likely, I think, to alert them and frighten them than a bell or any other kind of artificial noisemaker.
But you do recommend that in grizzly country you don't sneak around.
Well, I recommend that when you're traveling the trails and you're in heavily wooded, dense timber, and where you've seen sign of grizzlies, yeah, then it's a good thing to talk. But the best thing is not to worry. Chances of being attacked and injured by a grizzly are very remote, about like being struck by lightning, in spite of what you hear and see in the news. Because when it does occur, it makes headlines and we all hear about it, but it really doesn't occur very often.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Wright?
I'm curious, Dr. Craighead, about your background and interest in grizzly bears. Did you start studying grizzly bears while you were at the University of Montana, or did you start before that time? And how long have you been investigating the grizzly?
I've been at the University of Montana for a long while, so my interest in grizzlies really began when I was at the university. We started studying them, my brother and I, with the help of some of our colleagues, in 1959. I had an interest in the grizzly several years before that, but it did become evident to me that we knew very little about the grizzly, that it was an animal which we had to know much more about if we were going to manage it intelligently, especially in the large national parks where more and more people were coming to visit the parks, and the chances of a bear-man confrontation increases with the human use of the park. And so we undertook a study beginning in 1959 to gather information on population size, age structure of the population, reproductive biology, food habits, the spatial requirements for the grizzly, how far they moved, what types of food they ate, then the behavior between cubs and sows, and between the males and the females, and various physiological parameters we were interested in also.
Where did you make that initial study?
Well, we made it in what we call the Yellowstone ecosystem, which includes Yellowstone National Park and the adjoining national forests. There are 5 of them, and it's an area of about 5 million acres.
How long did that study go on?
We carried it on actively in the field for 12 seasons, or 12 years, and but we've been working on the data and also checking certain aspects of the study for a period, total about 18 years.
Just about ever since?
Just about ever since.
Right. Was there any particular incident, you mentioned bear-man confrontations, of course, which get so many headlines, any particular incident that precipitated that study, or did you just sort of decide that this was a real vacuum of information and you and your brother proceeded to launch into it?
Well, that's about it, yeah. No, in fact, at the time we started it, there was very little in the news about confrontations with grizzlies or critical habitat or anything of the sort, and very little public interest in the grizzly. But it was pretty evident that the grizzly did require wilderness areas and isolation, and that there was going to be less and less of that as time progressed. And so this is really how we got started.
You sort of saw the situation coming to a head, it looks like.
Well, yeah.
Wilderness areas diminishing, and the grizzly obviously going to be more and more confronted with man. And
right, and then also that we knew so little about the ecology or the biology of the grizzly. About the only information at that time was from a few of the naturalists that had recounted certain incidents, but for instance, there was nothing on population sizes anywhere, or age structure, or even good figures on the average size of litters, nothing on the reproductive rate of the grizzly. Very little on denning. When we started, we didn't even know whether a grizzly bear dug a den or used a natural den, whether they returned to the same dens, whether they took their yearlings back to a den or whether the yearlings left the female and hibernated by themselves, whether the males hibernated with or close to the females. None of this was known at the time.
Dr. Craighead, I think this is an excellent time in our program to get involved with some specific questions, a series of them, on the grizzly and what they're like. I will start this, and I'm sure the panel will continue it. The first question I have in relation to their behavior is, where do we find most grizzlies within the continental United States, or the 50 states, I should say? For the viewer who's not familiar with the subject, where would you locate most grizzlies?
Well, most of our grizzlies, of course, occur in Alaska, but outside of Alaska, within the contiguous 48 states, most of the grizzlies occur in 3 large ecosystems. The Yellowstone one, which we had just mentioned, of about 5 million acres, and then in the large Bob Marshall Scapegoat Wilderness, including Glacier National Park, which is a little over 3 million acres, and then up until very recently, there were grizzly bears in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, which, as you know, is mostly in Idaho and is another one of the very large wilderness areas, but it's very doubtful whether there's a viable population of grizzly bears in that wilderness at the present time.
The second part of this question in relation to that is, approximately how many grizzlies do we have within the continental United States? This week we've been talking about endangered species, for example, and I was wondering if we have a rather small or medium or large population.
Well, I'm sure any answer I give there'd be somebody that would have a different answer, but we're probably, I'm believing, about as good a position to make an estimate as anybody. We did accurately enumerate them in Yellowstone, where we color marked about 260 some bears and radio tracked 30 or 40 of them over a long period of time, and we estimated there that the population, maximum population, was about 225. But in the 3 ecosystems, I would say there's not over 700 or 800.
Okay. What is the life expectancy of a grizzly? About how long do they live?
Well, we've aged them by sectioning the teeth to 25 years.
Also, I'm sure our viewers would be interested in a little bit about their behavior patterns of where they, you mentioned this in relation to Dr. Wright's question of researching it. Where do they live, and what are their eating habits in particular?
Where do they live?
Yes. I'm not talking about the region, I'm talking about in that region where they live in caves or...
I see. Well, they live, of course, as I mentioned first, they do best in wilderness areas where they're isolated. And then in those large areas, they inhabit a wide range of habitat types. When they come out of the den in the spring, they'll frequently move down to the snow-free areas. And in Yellowstone, they'll feed on elk carcasses or kill elk that are in a state of malnutrition following severe winters. At that time, the grasses and sedges are just emerging, and these are, for plants at least, are high in protein, and the grizzly bear is a grazer. It's omnivorous, despite the fact that it's a carnivore. Most of its food is vegetation, and so they'll eat the green vegetation, and then they move up in the mountains with the recession of the snow. They feed on tubers, spring beauty, the glacier lily, the biscuit root, which was also eaten by the Indians, by Lewis and Clark. And they dig these, and then they'll move down as the berries ripen, especially the huckleberries and the which are known as the vacciniums. And then there are a number of other berries that they eat, strawberries, the Oregon grape, quite a few. And then as the fall approaches, they move back up to the ridges, and feed on white bark pine nuts when these are abundant. But these fluctuate. The crop, the nut crop fluctuates widely, and in fact, so do the crop of berries. So bear has to move quite a bit. It has to cover a lot of ground. The home range may be anywhere from as small as 30 square miles up to an area of 500 or 600 square miles, and we think that one bear that we tracked for a long time in Yellowstone probably had a range in excess of 1,000 square miles. And the home range contains a wide range of habitat types, from the alpine fir habitat types to the white bark pine, to the spruce, combination of spruce and fir, and even down into the Douglas fir, which you find at the lower altitudes.
Thank you. Mary Lou Reed.
Dr. Craighead, could you tell us a little bit about their family life? Do they seem to travel in pairs? You mentioned the denning, and do they seem to den in pairs, or are they loners?
Well, I'm not sure where to start on this. They tend to exploit food sources wherever they find them, a lot of food. And so this frequently brings many grizzlies together. Otherwise, they tend to be loners. Males don't travel with the females after they have cubs. They're with them only during the breeding season. But wherever they congregate, they tend to be regulated and by a social hierarchy, such as we find in many other species. There'll be one male usually that's at the top of the hierarchy, and there are lesser males down the line, but this enables them to still to feed, to exploit a food source, a large number, without fighting, without one dominating the situation. And then when the females come out of the dens with cubs, they're very protective, and there are situations where the large males will kill the cubs. And whether this is a population regulating mechanism or not, we don't know, but they do kill them, and the females will very courageously defend the young, and we've observed a lot of battles of that nature. Then, partly because of this, there's a tendency for some females with cubs to develop strong bonds between one another, and they may travel throughout an entire season with their cubs, two females, or as many as 3 females. And they nurse one another's cubs. Female having cubs 1 year may carry them through to yearlings, and then wean them and mate. But another female that's been traveling with her may not come into estrus. She may keep her cubs and carry them to 2-year-olds, and then she may adopt the cubs of the female she's been traveling with.
In a group situation like that, will the male grizzly attack any of the cubs? If there are two or three females with cubs, are they then considered fairly safe?
Yes, normally not. A large male grizzly feels rather subdued around 2 or more females, particularly ones that are aggressive, and the individual aggressiveness varies quite a bit with individual bears.
But this would really indicate that the girls are getting together in order to protect themselves against these marauding males.
Right. Yeah.
Do the males ever seem to fight for territory? You said that there seems to be an established hierarchy when they come together for food, but obviously each of these bears requires a fairly large territory. Do they seem to establish a turf?
We found no evidence whatsoever that the grizzly was territorial. They, of course, have home ranges, but these home ranges overlap, and the male ranges of males overlap the ranges of females, and the ranges of males overlap females, and the ranges of young and subadults tend to overlap the adults. And the social hierarchy really is a substitute for territoriality. But even at the dens, we didn't find any defensive dens by which we thought we might. There is a certain amount of defense at a kill. If a bear, say, kills an elk, it'll feed on it, and it may defend it against the first bear that comes in. But if several bears come in, eventually the hierarchy is established based on aggressiveness and age, and then all of those bears will feed on that carcass.
They really sound pretty peaceful, as if they are not going out of their way to fight.
Well, yeah, and they've evolved a system that enables them really to survive, because in spite of the size of the grizzly, and it's still a task for that large an animal to get enough food. If they fought each other every time they got a big source of food, such as an elk or a berry patch, why, they probably wouldn't have survived.
Do they have to spend an inordinate amount of time eating in order to maintain that bulk?
They spend a good bit of their time, yes. For instance, they do a lot of grazing, and yet they're not a grazing animal, and they don't have the
teeth.
They don't have the stomach or the intestinal tract to digest vegetation the way a ruminant does. And so they have to eat quite a bit of it. But they also have to supplement that with high-protein food, such as meat. And they get this in the form of rodents, big game, although they're very inefficient predators on big game. It's not often that they kill a healthy elk.
You mean they aren't really that good at hunting?
They're not that efficient, no. A mountain lion is far more efficient predator than the grizzly bear is.
I have one last little family question. Do they seem to fight during, the males fight during mating season?
Yes, they do.
They do that.
Yeah, there are really some very terrific battles between the dominant male and a male that's vying for that position, and they'll inflict very severe wounds. But in all the work we did, we never saw one kill another one, because they evidence submissive behavior. They'll lower their head, turn to one side, and that's a sign to the other bear, and the fight stops, and the other bear can turn its back, and it won't, the victorious one won't attack, or that's the end of the fight.
So their social status is perhaps established during the mating system in which they...
Primarily, yes. It also is established at feeding sites, too, throughout the year, where a large male can come into an area to feed, and as other bears come in, they feed pretty much according to the status that they...
Pecking order.
Pecking order, right.
Thank you.
Dr. Wright.
Observing a grizzly bear fight must be kind of an awesome thing. You must have films of some of these, I suppose.
I have some films. I wish I had films of some of the fights that I've observed, but many of the fights occur at dusk or even after dark. And but I did on one occasion see a bear weighing 700 or 800 pounds, male, pick up another male weighing 600 or 700 pounds and literally shaking like a rat terrier would a rat.
It gives you some feel for their strength, doesn't it?
Right.
I'm curious about the relationship of the grizzly to other bears. I've read, of course, the grizzly is the king of bears, and that they will fight black bears, and of course the black bears will lose in a confrontation between the two. How aggressive is this true? Are they pretty domineering and aggressive toward other species of bears?
Well, to start with, I think I would say, and I've had quite a lot of experience with black bears and a good bit of experience with polar bears, some experience with Alaskan brown, that the grizzly is by far the most aggressive of the four. And in areas where there are black bears, you find the black bears inhabiting the wooded areas, of course, because they can climb, and they escape from the grizzly that way. You don't find them out in the open, or very rarely, or if you do, it's an exceptionally large black bear. The grizzly will kill the black. On the other hand, I've seen them put black bears up trees, and then almost, you say, tease them. They wait until the bear starts to come down, gets almost to the ground, they'll rush over and put him back up the tree again. Seems almost like a game. We never got a lot of data on actual mortality of black bears by grizzlies, and I think one of the reasons is that where you've got a lot of grizzlies, you don't normally have a lot of blacks.
I'm curious also about the genetic relationship between different kinds of bears. There are supposedly subspecies, and I've read that the Alaskan brown bear is perhaps another type of grizzly bear, and that they could or even have interbred. Can you clarify, verify, or disprove this for us?
Well, I think polar bears and the Alaskan brown bear have interbred, and the grizzly and the Alaskan brown, but they are separated geographically, and whether those offspring were fertile or not, I couldn't tell you for sure.
There doesn't seem to be any genuine data that a chromosomal mapping or something similar hasn't been done on the bears to prove whether they really are the same species or not.
Well, the black bear, the European brown bear, the grizzly bear, and the Alaskan brown bear are all placed in the same, no, wait a minute, with the exception of the black, they're placed in they're the same species, but different subspecies.
So that means that if they're different subspecies, they are capable then of interbreeding. Is that right?
Yeah, right.
But because of geographical factors, generally don't.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Craighead, recently in preparation of a script for a movie, we were interviewing a gentleman who was discussing the vanishing species and their disappearance, and he made the comment that he did not care. Why should we? He says, we don't miss the dinosaur, was his comment. How would you answer such a comment as this in relation to the grizzly?
Would we miss it, you mean?
Yes. His argument was that when certain species or certain animals disappear from the Earth, they're really not missed. He says, we've got along without the dinosaur. We don't really miss the dinosaur, was his contention. And he contends that such other animals as the grizzly would not be missed if they totally disappeared. How do you answer that type of criticism?
Well, I would answer it in two ways. I think, first, that man has a moral obligation to see that other species aren't exterminated. And the other is well, we've learned through ecological studies that whenever we lose diversity, we lose stability in the environment. So if we lose the grizzly, that's weakening the ecological stability. Then you add to that the coyote, you add that the wolf, and so on. So from philosophical and scientific standpoint, it's hard to justify the extinction of any species.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest is Dr. John Craighead, who is a professor and a consultant with graduate students in wildlife at the University of Montana, and is especially an expert on grizzlies. We shall continue the questioning, and the questioning will come from Mary Lou Reed.
Dr. Craighead, is the grizzly on the endangered species list? What is the status of the grizzly?
The grizzly is a threatened species, not an endangered one, and Congress passed the Endangered Species Act in 1973, and then it was modified in 1975, and at that time the grizzly was placed on the list as a threatened species.
What obligation then did the government assume by putting the grizzly on the threatened list? Is there some expectation that?
Yes. When the grizzly was placed on the threatened list, it meant that the government had to do whatever it could to perpetuate the species and, if possible, to expand the range of the species and to protect its habitat and or critical habitat, as the Act says. And critical habitat is usually defined as an area essential to a species and which supplies all of its biological requirements. That is, in the case of the grizzly, it would be feeding areas, space, areas for breeding, areas for retreats, and things of that sort.
Are you satisfied with the activity that the government is now doing? Is this under what, Department of Fish and Wildlife, under Interior?
Fish and Wildlife Service. Mm-hmm. Well, it was the responsibility of the Fish and Wildlife Service to, with the help of other federal and state agencies, to delineate what is critical habitat for the grizzly bear. And the Fish and Wildlife Service came up with a total area of about 13 million acres. And this is just a preliminary delineation. The next step is to take a real hard look at these areas and see just how much of the area is really critical and why it's critical and what area where there's competition, say, between the bear and man. And then in these areas, are they really essential to the survival of the grizzly, or aren't they? And this is what's being done right now. And in Yellowstone, where we studied the bear for nearly 18 years, we've pretty well defined that to our satisfaction. Now, the government agencies, of course, are the ones that make the final decision.
Well, do you think that ideally the critical habitat of the grizzly should be delineated and then man should be perhaps prohibited from going inside that area? Or do you think in your own mind that grizzly and men can coexist in perhaps the same wilderness area?
Well, I think the grizzly and man can coexist. We know enough about the grizzly to coexist with him, but it's going to require quite a few concessions on them. And in some instances, it's going to probably require a curtailment of certain land use practices.
Such as?
Well, such as even heavy recreational use in some areas. In some areas, logging roads open up the country, and with the opening of the country, you get more people going in, and grizzlies are poached. The death rate, in other words, the grizzly bear rises as his domain's invaded, whether it's by the grazing interests or the logging interests or recreationists. But that doesn't, I don't think, mean that these areas can't be used jointly.
So you think logging could actually go on in an area that was designated critical habitat?
I think in some of the areas it could, if it's done under the right conditions. And in fact, there's some indication that certain types of logging produces better crops of berries or the huckleberries than unlogged areas. But on the other hand, we know that when you go in and log an area and open it up to roads, that you're also exposing the grizzly bear to a higher death rate. And my view is that habitat is really not the problem. We've got almost 10 10 to 12 million acres set aside in wilderness areas and national parks for the grizzly, it's probably more land's been than's been set aside for any other species. But in our studies, we found that the grizzly bear has a very low reproductive rate. That is, it can't reproduce itself rapidly. It amounts to about producing, for a female, about 1 cub per adult female every 2 years. And where you get a high man-caused mortality rate for the grizzly, then really what you've got is that bears are dying faster than they're being born. And I think this is the real crux of the matter. I think we've got to have regulations that both within the national parks and in the national forests and the fish and game departments that give the grizzly more protection than it's had in the past.
So habitat isn't the problem, but the pressures upon the bear then become...
I wouldn't say habitat isn't a problem. I would say it's not the most critical problem. But as I mentioned earlier, if man invades the habitat in sufficient numbers, he brings the result is that more bears die. And so he's really increasing the man-caused mortality rate. At the same time, we have no evidence that the grizzly can compensate for these unusually high death rate by producing more cubs, either shortening the reproductive cycle or increasing the number of cubs that are produced in a given litter, or in raising more of the young produced to adult stage where they begin to produce offspring.
Thank you.
Dr. Wright.
You mentioned area set aside right now around 13,000. No, you mentioned that the United States government had identified about 13 million acres as perhaps critical habitat. I'm assuming that you're talking about in the lower 48 states.
Right.
That's not Alaska.
No, that's excluding Alaska.
You made the estimate, and you said it certainly would be open to debate, that we might have a population now, including Alaska.
No, excluding.
Excluding Alaska, of about 700
to 800.
to 800 bears. That doesn't strike me as very many bears. And I'm wondering a couple of things. First of all, do you have any idea yet what sort of order of magnitude you're talking about for a viable population of grizzly bears? And does it bother you at all that that the United States government's approach is one of looking at critical habitat? In other words, are we saying that we're willing to let the grizzly bear go down right to the, to the borderline of viability and non-viability, and then we'll shut the doors and say that's critical and we're going to leave? Now we're going to leave them alone. Is this the right approach, in your opinion?
Well, I don't think that is the approach they've taken. I think the federal agency, and the Fish and Wildlife Service in particular, has taken a broad view, and they've included a good bit of land in what they term as critical habitat, and I think this is justified initially, because they've indicated that then, with more studies and with as we get more and more information from the private sector and from other government and state agencies, that these boundaries will be modified. And 13 million acres is a lot of land, as I mentioned. One of the problems is that it's very difficult to census the animal. It's very difficult to even get the mortality rate, because we know generally how many are killed by hunters, but illegal kills are hard to run down. And I think this is one of the weakest points in the preservation of the grizzly, is that if we tend to manage it on a basis of known hunter kills and against only a population estimate, then we're going to run into trouble. But if we manage them on the basis that we know the reproductive rate is low, so regardless of what the size of the population is, they're not going to be able to recover fast from heavy mortality. So we keep the mortality down and maintain the habitat. There's no reason why we shouldn't have grizzlies for a long time to come, and they can coexist with people in these large national parks and national wilderness areas. But it's going to take a lot more refined management than we've had in the past to do this.
Have you and your brother got any answers or speculation as to what, if anything, has happened to the grizzly bear populations in two of the really large Idaho areas, the Selway Bitterroot, which you've already mentioned, which you think no longer has a viable grizzly bear population, and the Idaho primitive area, which is a tremendously big area, but apparently is without any grizzly bears. Do you have any idea what's happened?
Well, I've got some educated guesses, and we're going to be doing some studies, I think, in that region in the near future. But the early history indicates that there were not a lot of grizzlies. I mean, they were never as the area was never as heavily populated with grizzlies, say, as the Glacier and Bob Marshall or the Yellowstone. And then in the Selway Bitterroot, you had steelhead and salmon runs that were quite extensive, which have largely been lost in the Laxaw and the Selway, which were undoubtedly a source of food for the grizzly. The whitebark pine, which is very important, has diminished greatly due to disease attacks over the last 20, 30 years or more. And we don't really know what the situation was in early days with regard to the vaccinium of the berries, but the situation could be better now than it was in the past. As far as the green vegetation, this is one of the most stable of the foods, and it's one reason apparently the grizzly is, although a carnivore, has turned to eating grasses and sedges and tubers, is that they're usually available in large quantities year after year.
Are you in favor of reintroducing the grizzly bear to, say, the Selway Bitterroot in the Idaho primitive area? Or
I wouldn't say I'm in favor or not in favor. I would say this, that we have the technology to do it, and that when at the right time the public's sufficiently educated and the private interests are sufficiently educated on what's involved, and when enough work's been done to determine whether, if we take bears from one ecosystem and put them into another, they'll actually stay, and how many we'd need to get a viable population that they would reproduce, then I think it'd be the time to decide whether it's a good idea or not. And we've obviously got a long way to go before we have the answers to that question.
Dr. Craighead, I'd like to move into another area with you. I know that through television and other sources that you and your family are well known for your trips, river trips and rafting and so forth. And from a review of those that I have seen, it seems to me that there's some preparation and also for the trip, and then while on the trip, things that one has to do to enjoy it and to be safe. For those who are taking up this activity of traveling over our rivers and rafting in particular, would you do two things for us? First, suggest to them how they should prepare for a trip, and then secondly, while on the trip for several days or weeks, what they should look out for during that trip, or how they should try to live from day to day as they, at night in particular, camp for the evening.
Well, I assume that you're referring to a trip down one of our whitewater rivers.
Yes.
Well, on a trip down say a river like the Middle Fork of the Salmon or the main Salmon, first it's important to have a good raft, not a cheap one that's going to tear up on the first rock. And it's also important to have quite a bit of experience before you start out on it. There's a lot of it takes a lot of experience and a lot of expertise to read water, to know how you can go through a rapid, to know what is safe and what isn't, to know when water levels are dangerous and when they're not. And I'd advise anyone that wants to do this and do it on their own to get quite a bit of experience first on other rivers that are less difficult to run than the Salmon or the Middle Fork, especially if they're going to go as a family. Then with regard to taking care of yourself on the river, it's almost imperative to have warm clothing, because even in summer, a river like the Middle Fork, the water temperatures are very low. They're down in, they can be in the low 40s and or up into the upper 40s, but you don't survive very long in cold water. So you either should wear a partial wetsuit or have warm clothing that you can change to immediately, because you're going to be in the wet a good bit of the time. And then as far as camping, there are not too many hazards there. The main thing is to get a campsite that's well above the any possible water fluctuation that might occur during the night. There are rattlesnakes in some of those areas, but again, like a grizzly bear, it's the chances of getting into any trouble with them really is fairly remote. But it's good to know they're there and to keep a lookout.
Would you suggest that medical supplies for this type of possible accident? I know that on one of your trips, I believe one of the young men had to be taken out by helicopter for surgery, and do you need to stay in some kind of communication with?
No, I don't think you do. Ironically, that was the only time in all the years and all the trips we've taken that we ever did have communication. It happened the Forest Service had a helicopter there at that time. It had nothing to do with our trip, but it was very fortunate. We could have lost my youngest boy if we hadn't had it. But you can't plan for that kind of an emergency, I think, but you can take a good first aid kit and a good medical kit, and I think antibiotics are one thing, all types of bandages, tourniquet, some drugs for muscle relaxing are often good, but that depends a lot on the individual. You can take some of these splints that are inflatable splints if someone breaks a leg, and that can occur very easily on a river trip. The rocks are slick and someone falls and you got a broken leg, you really got a problem. But mostly you need to be in good condition. If you're in good condition when you start, you're going to end up in even better condition when you're through.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Dr. Craighead, everything I know about wildflowers I learned from the book that you and your brother compiled, The Field Guide to Rocky Mountain Wildflowers. And I'm curious to know whether or not you continue to keep up with your research on wildflowers.
Yes, I do, although it's more applied botany. I'm very interested in, for instance, in the plants the grizzly bears eat and elk eat, and I'm still interested in ones that human beings can use when they're out in the wilderness. But I'd say yes,
Have you found any more flowers, discovered any flowers since you published that book? And I don't know the date. I think that's 19.
It's way back. I can't remember either. Well, I'm not a professional botanist, and I haven't been particularly interested in seeking new species or subspecies. So I haven't done any work along that line now.
Thank you.
Dr. Wright.
Dr. Craighead, you and your brother Frank were right in the middle of a controversy involving the management of bears in Yellowstone Park, I believe. Is that
You believe right,
is
yeah.
that a fair assessment?
Yeah,
Could you,
that's a fair statement. Yeah.
Could you tell us about that situation and where, what the outcome has been, and is it resolved now?
Well, it's a long story, and I'm not sure it's something I want to discuss here. I will say that I think that it's been pretty well resolved at this time. And I think that more and more there's going to be a situation in which grizzly bear is given every break possible in that Yellowstone ecosystem, and that scientists from the outside will be welcomed into the park to do research work, and that this will supplement work being done by park biologists. I hope this is what we have coming in the future.
I don't begin to know all the details of the controversy either, and you said you don't want to discuss the whole thing on the program. Were you in favor, or was it one of your recommendations to close the garbage dumps in Yellowstone Park, for example?
Yes, we made the recommendation to close them. The controversy really arose over whether they should be closed quickly or whether they should be closed over a long period of time. And it also was resolved around whether independent researchers should be providing information on management of a resource in a national park, or whether the national park should have its own biologists and its own data. And it's really a complex issue that hard to discuss in a short period of time. But I think in the long run, it's getting straightened out, and that I think that as a result of it, the grizzly bear is in a much better situation now than it would have been if we hadn't had the controversy. If I can put it that way.
Okay. It sounds to me like you're fairly happy then with the long-range outcome of the...
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Is the grizzly bear classified now as a game species in all the western states that have the bear?
It's a game species in Montana and in Wyoming, but there hasn't been a season in Idaho for quite a few years, and I don't think it is classified as a game animal in Idaho.
I'm fairly certain it's not. Do you think it's permissible and desirable to hunt the bear in the states that have sufficient numbers?
Yeah, well, I think, yes. I think that that it is desirable to hunt them, provided the managing agencies make every effort to keep down the illegal killing, to prevent conflicts between land use conflicts where the bear should have the where there shouldn't be competition between bear and other land uses. And if they do this, and if they keep this mortality down, then I think that it isn't going to hurt to take a few bears each year, because in spite of the low reproductive rate, the grizzly is like any other animal. If the populations can grow, they can expand, and this will happen if the mortality rate is reduced too low. And then they get into trouble, and when they do get into trouble, there's a tendency to take it out on the grizzly. If someone's injured, then a number of grizzlies are killed, or if livestock's taken, then maybe more than the offending animal's taken. And so I think that hunting is a check on overpopulation, but it has to be used very, very carefully and precisely, with an understanding of the reproductive rate of the species, the habitat requirements, and what can happen if man-caused mortalities increase rapidly. Because the population can go down very rapidly when the man-caused mortality rate rises.
Mary Lou Reed.
Dr. Craighead, are you worried about the image that the grizzly bear has in people's minds in terms of the fact that they're afraid of it? You mentioned earlier the headliners, and we have, you know, Claus kind of mentality and Night of the Grizzly. And do you fear that this is as big a threat to the grizzly as actually the moving in on its territory?
Well, of course, I don't like to see movies like Claus, but I think it's good for the people to have a good, healthy respect for the grizzly. The Indian really respected the grizzly, but he had, he also, let's say he had a lot of respect for the grizzly. And I think we should too, but I don't think we should go into the wilderness afraid that we're going to be attacked by grizzlies every time we set up a camp. And I think there has been a lot of this type of information spread, and there are a good many sectors in our society that are afraid to go into wilderness because of grizzly bears. I don't like to see this, but I think that we can and we are educating them to the fact that the grizzly's not the menace that it's made out to be, but it's nevertheless an animal to be respected when you are in the wilderness.
Are you particularly concerned about any other species are you studying any other species that you feel are threatened or could be rare or endangered or threatened? In your studies, like the bighorn sheep, this I would assume that you would be seeing some of them too.
Well, I think the biologists have been doing some good studies on bighorn sheep, and I think as long as we maintain habitat for bighorns, that we shouldn't have too big a problem. Whether to hunt the big rams or not, it's a question. You get biologists on either side of that question, but I do think that the quotas have to be in line again with the reproductive rate of the animal. They have to be kept fairly low in the case of bighorn sheep. I've worked quite a bit with birds of prey, and the peregrine, of course, is endangered, but a great deal is being done to take care of that situation now.
I must interrupt Dr. Craighead. We're out of time, and on behalf of our panel, I want to express our very sincere appreciation for an excellent presentation and informative information on the grizzly and the other subjects that we dealt with. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. John Craighead from the University of Montana, discussing in particular the grizzly, of which he is an expert. Please be with us again next week at 6 p.m. when again we'll be interviewing a personality. And until that time, may I wish you a good evening.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by videotape recording.